Thomas.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, so and there we are, Thomas. So, Thomas, welcome to the session. And I know you have a very nice presentation on the strategy and tactics of test automation, all prepared for us. So, without further ado, I think I'll hand the mic over to you, and you get in there, and like I say, what will happen is any questions I would read them back to you later on as they pop them up into the chat.
Will do.
Okay.
Will do. Thank you for the kind
All right.
introduction.
All yours, Thomas.
All right, let's switch on over to the main presentation here. All right, welcome to the Strategy and Tactics of Test Automation, also known as the Automation Fire Hose. I'm your host, Thomas Haver. So in today's session, I'm going to show you about how to effectively implement automation for your team or your organization. In order to do so, we must start at the beginning here, as in the origin story for a lot of the test automation and the common challenges that were faced at many organizations. Over the course of our session, we're going to learn about the appropriate approach you should take for automation, some of the framework and tools you should use to find the right tool for the job, some of the common challenges faced by people today in implementing automation, how you can schedule it in to the regular SDLC, some of the quality standards you should take, and metrics that I leave at the end as part of the supplementary information in the presentation if folks are interested in obtaining it. So, more than the kind introduction. So my name is Thomas. I work for M&T Bank as a master software engineer. My team posts at Red Green Refactor. It's a blog on automation and DevOps. Before I was in IT, I was a scientist for around a decade, studying molecular fluorescence spectroscopy and microscopy. I'm also an avid board gamer. My favorite board game is Diplomacy. Diplomacy right here, for those of you who can look in real closely. And I'm an evangelist for Ruby Cucumber. It's sort of my primary tool set that I most enjoyed in helping teams adopt behavior-driven development. And of course, I have a lovely cartoon family here. So let's dive into our talk right now. First, with the background of an origin story. What I like to do in a lot of my talks is provide background information to reach a shared understanding. I want us to use the same terms and come to an understanding of what those mean. So when I say strategy, I mean a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major or overall aim. When I talk about tactics, what I mean is the art or skill of employing your available means to accomplish an end. So, for instance here, Star-Lord had a fantastic strategy for defeating Thanos in the Infinity War movie, but his own emotional tactics ended up costing his team, and Thanos was able to snap half the universe. So even though you may have a good strategy, if tactically you cannot implement it, you'll end up in failure. The challenges that we faced with regards to test automation are not new. They've been around for as long as people were doing test automation, and regardless of how large your organization is. Let's take, for instance, Microsoft. So Microsoft owned one of the most challenging applications to test and also one of the most problematic applications of all time in Internet Explorer. So whenever they needed to go through a change to Internet Explorer, whether it's a major change, a minor change, they needed to consider these primary testing variables: the IE version, the service pack that they would have, the different operating systems to work on, and they had about 32 different language binaries with which to address. So even for a company as large as Microsoft, with the resources they had available, they were not able to effectively test all combinations. So what do you do in this circumstance? Well, the approach that they took way back in 2004 was to identify the most popular or most valuable combinations according to their user base. And they bucketed in those combinations for testing focus. This allowed them to perform what we know as risk-based testing. It also allowed them to create what we also now know as personas to test to. So even though you may run into these challenges of there are too many potential combinations to test in, you can still effectively determine where you should devote your time and energy. And I'd say that same lesson applies today. When we're going to adopt a test automation approach, we're not going to automate everything. It's not even feasible to do so, but we're going to take that risk-based approach. When I've worked for multiple organizations and coming in and helping them adopt test automation, It's always had this sort of promise of it's going to save your time and lower costs while raising quality. From the leadership, I also get the added requirements that, oh, by the way, you can't affect project delivery timelines, and you're not allowed to steal the capacity of our existing people, which makes it a very challenging task indeed to implement. So it's not a silver bullet, nor is it something where you sprinkle the magic fairy dust of automation and you end up having effective change. It's something that you need to commit to for the long term. It's another application in place that you are simply going to devote time to. Its purpose is to test other applications. So you should take the same degree of care that you would for any other applications. Automation is not a discrete activity. Going also back into our way back machine from Elfriede Dustin's Implementing Automated Software Testing book, generally an application's lifespan follows this pattern, that as it gets older, the cost and time to deliver increases. And at the same time, your test coverage and quality decreases. Shown here is a discrete activity where automation is introduced. Suddenly you have increased quality and test coverage and reduced time and cost to deliver. But automation here is not something where you introduce once and leave it be. It is a continuous activity that you need to develop alongside your application. It is something else that you need to devote your time to. So if you want to have increased quality and test coverage and reduce time and cost, it's something you need to bake into your team's life cycle. So it's a requirement for you to go to production to also have effective test automation in place. So whenever I help out a team or go into an organization and I want to support their automation, I look at what is the scope you have involved? What are the objectives you're hoping to reach? What is the best approach that we can take given our current climate? What are some of the framework and tools that will be a best fit for the organization? What sort of environments are you looking to test against and the constraints that you exist from a data perspective? How can we schedule this in to a team's existing SDLC? And lastly, and I think most importantly, what is this technical skill set of the team? I can't introduce specific approaches or framework and tools if the team's not equipped to adopt them. So let's look at approach as an example here. If we're going to adopt the correct approach for test automation, we want to have people have a consistent answer to the question, what should we automate? Some of the questions you would have for that is the test or task going to be repeated and how often? How much time could be saved? Are the requirements low risk, stable, and unlikely to change? Is it something that's subject to human error? Is it time consuming? Do you have a lot of downtime? And is it something that is repetitive? We want to have, independent of a given person, the same set of questions. And I like to use it as sort of an automation checklist to make that determination of what should we automate when you're going through a tasking session or product backlog refinement. So that way, at that point in time, when you're pulling work into the team space, you can make a determination of, yes, this is something that's going to provide value for us to automate, rather than blanket say, we're going to try to automate everything. Additionally, you need to change the mindset of folks working around automation, both team members as well as those folks who are working on an organization level. Those test automation scripts you write should be treated the same as development code. That means that every new test that you write should factor in those maintenance costs, just the same way as every new bit of code you write for the application under test can accrue potential tech debt, so too could automation. Some basic costs with our automation include the tooling itself, operating system upgrades, language upgrades, and of course you have to maintain some documentation around implementation and onboarding. So the cost is not just simply the time it takes to implement an automated test, it's much more than that. And it should be factored into your ROI calculations. And I think if you start to do so within your own team, you're going to see that you shouldn't necessarily automate everything. You should be more selective in your approach. So consider those automation costs. Additionally, we all face organizational constraints. It doesn't matter whether you work for a large financial institution or a startup. We all have system constraints that are related to delivery schedule, project budget, and the technical skill set of the individuals in the team. So we should then instead take the approach to automate based upon the frequency of use or criticality of that flow, including potential legal risk. These are criteria that you should consider in determining what should we automate. So you need to look for complex manual scenarios that maybe require data or environment setup, because those are things that are prone to human error. Those are also things that are laborious, that people don't want to do, that are best handled by automation. So those are prime targets for you to focus your efforts on. And this is where I go from that checklist to what's known as an automation scorecard. And I recommend doing this on a team-by-team basis, pulling in some organizational level scorecard items. What I mean by that is you can either create a scale, say on 0 to 10 for a category, or use a simple like check item that you have here, where based upon the features for your application, generate a set of criteria, whether you think it's on a critical path or frequently used, whether you have some legal constraints around validation, whether you have data and environment set up, whether it's primed for reuse, where you can use part of those scripts for additional tests. Once you set up those quality criteria in your scorecard, you can then stack rank your features within your application to determine what are going to be the most valuable features to automate. And given that we're always constrained by time, you can work from the top down, as in focus your efforts on the most valuable features first. Taking this approach also allows you to identify technical debt in the form of flows that you should have automated, but you did not for whatever reason. You can at least create those as backlog items for your team that you're supporting to show that, yes, we have these gaps here, and you make it visible for all. What I further advise is you create some form of a cutoff. Not that we're committing to automate everything, but you say, hey, below this certain score level, this is something that should just be a manual validation and does not need to occur as frequently. So you devote your time to having a smaller subset of tests, but those tests are very valuable because, again, we have to factor in those maintenance costs for every test that we write. So when I'm helping out teams, I say, all right, you're devoting your time to test automation, but is it good or not? Well, part of it relates to the strategy that we use, and part of it relates to those tactics. So when I say good test automation, I mean it's something that should enhance testing instead of replacing it. It should be helping testers do their jobs instead of replacing them. It should be part of your SDLC, and it should be beyond simple automated checks at the service level, say on like a UI. Those automated tests should be focused and informative. It should tell you about the current state of your application. And those tests should be trustworthy and repeatable. What I mean by that is you need to be able to generate an execution report or have dashboards that show the current state of your application. If every time you execute, you end up with 50% of your tests failing, then people will stop looking at that CI report. They'll stop looking at the dashboard because they don't trust your tests. And then the things that really fail and you should investigate are left unchecked, and you end up having escape defects reaching production. So what this means is you should have a smaller test bed of 100 reliable tests over a 10,000 suite test that you have 50% failures. And it's a different 50% each time. So make your tests trustworthy and repeatable. In selecting framework and tooling, you have a lot of opportunities in the industry. Some of these are open source, some of these are pay. And you have the opportunity to adopt automation for whatever application type you have under test. So here's a simple and I would say anti-pattern example using Gherkin. So like, why would you end up using something like Gherkin as the top level? Well, you would use it if your intent is to collaborate amongst all members of the team and not just have it be someone who's your SDET writing tests. Because if it's just your SDET, you don't need this abstraction layer. So if you're going to use Gherkin as a sort of like top level as part of your tool set, in this example, you would have, say, Selenium underneath the covers. That's for web validation. You could use programming language. In this case, it's Ruby and Cucumber, which allows you to write that top level validation in plain English. So this is just one option. But let's dive into Selenium, because this is sort of where we get to the point of when you're adopting tooling, you want to find the best tool for the job, not just blanket say, hey, here's the tooling we're going to use. In my organization right now, we use a whole bunch of tooling for web automation as long as it fits the patterns and practices that we care about. So for Selenium, why is this a good example of tooling that is ubiquitous in the industry? Well, Selenium itself has been re-implemented in a number of different programming languages. So pretty much every programming language underneath the sun that you want to work with, you have a Selenium implementation. So that means if you wanted to, you could align the test automation tech stack with the application tech stack, most especially if you're trying to get your existing development team members to adopt it. There's always this hesitancy to adopt a new tooling, especially if it's in a new programming language. If you can make sure that they have one foot safely in the zone that they are comfortable with as an existing language, then you're biasing yourself to success for adoption of a new tool and a new process, being test automation. It also reduces maintenance costs because you keep your tech stack size smaller. So be selective in your choice of toolings. There's no one best tool for, say, mainframe automation, for desktop automation, for mobile automation, for web automation. There's a number of tools out there. It's about finding the best tool for the job to ensure that people are actually writing those automated tests and you're getting the results that you expect out of it. Additionally, you should adopt automation coding standards. So say for a given set of automated tests, you want to minimize the amount of maintenance work that you incur in writing those automated tests. So that means making the code that you have underneath the covers as tight as possible, as small as possible in terms of number of lines that you have to actually support. Right? You want it to be something that's easily adoptable. So in this case, anytime you want to work with a web application, you of course are going to be clicking on the page a lot if you're working on UI-based automation. Well, instead of writing a click method for every single object you're going to interact with, which would be laborious, you want to implement, a pattern. In this case, the user clicks and then insert name of object here that will allow you to actually click on any sort of object. So you end up having 5 lines of code that could accept any time that you're going to click on an application. And click on an element within a web page. So why would you take this approach like code Lego? I'd say the style that you see here within the individual steps are imperative, which is, I would say, an anti-pattern, because you don't want to describe the how in those discrete steps. You want to describe the why the user is interacting with the system the way they are, what the goal they have. But the point being, you can take those little imperative steps and you can take that code Lego and wrap it into declarative style, such that it talks about the why the user is accomplishing this goal rather than the how. So that way you make it domain-based so everyone on the team can understand, and you have the component parts underneath the covers that make it very simple to implement. In this case, this web suite has about 300 lines of total code underneath the covers to maintain. So lines of code generally is something that is an output of a developer is a bad thing. But in this case, trying to keep your automation suite as small as possible to minimize the maintenance costs such that you maximize the amount of actual automated tests that you have on the top end is something that's quite valuable. You don't want to spend your time fixing your automation suite. You want to spend your time writing and executing your automated tests. At this point, I've shown a few examples with like UI-based automation, functional tests. But those aren't the most valuable tests on here. So if we want to extend it further and say, all right, if we want to find issues with our application earlier in the development, we need to focus more on integration testing, where we're looking at interfaces or modules tested as a group, more focused on the service level validation. These integration tests are more robust than flaky UI for repeatable tasks. Additionally, if you want to try to align your application under test with your automated tests, you have frameworks that are available for you in just about every single language under the sun, which makes it easier for you to keep your tech stack slim. And taking this one step further in terms of where we should focus our efforts is unit testing, right? That's the fastest method of testing. It's easier to debug, it's reusable, it's got a low cost to fix. And of course, with whatever programming language is your primary for your application under test, you have a unit testing framework that's available for you. So this should be a strict requirement to have your application unit tested, to have service level integration tests that are present, and then also to have some functional tests. But you need to start with those unit tests because that's where you're going to get the fastest feedback. When working with many teams across many years, I've seen similar challenges come up again and again. These are just a few of them that I'd like to relay upon you. One of those is the eponymous name of our presentation being the automation firehose itself. So this is where I see teams tend to follow along with, here's a shiny new tool that they have to adopt, and suddenly they're going to try to automate everything under the sun. Just because you can automate a scenario does not mean that you should do it. You want to adopt a risk-based approach for automation such that you end up in a state where your smaller set of tests are something that are going to be consistently executed and end up being very valuable, rather than a huge test bed that is inconsistent in its execution and tough to maintain. Additionally, I've seen people encounter problems related to data failure, as in they will have an automated test that will work in a given environment. And once you promote the code to another environment, it fails because the data you had only referenced one single environment. What you want to do is make sure that your automation is cross-environment compatible. That means your test data generation and manipulation should be an upfront concern. So that test data access should be part of your ready state criteria to begin work for that development item, which means that it should be ready for testing as well. So you need to ensure that you have full programmatic access to test data so that way you can be cross-environment compatible. Think about this purely from a value standpoint. If you write an automated test once and it only works in a given environment, sure, you get some value out of it. But if your automated test can work across multiple test environments, including potentially prod, aren't you doubling, tripling, quadrupling the value provided from your automation test? So make sure that you're cross-environment compatible as an upfront concern. Additionally, I've seen teams write tests that will pass, and you execute again, fail, execute again, pass, fail, on and off, green, red, green, red, like Christmas tree lights. So these are flickering or flaky tests. What you want to end up doing is remove them and investigate them. So automated tests that don't consistently pass are soon ignored by the entire team. The execution report that you send off to the rest of the team, the dashboards you should have, should actually mean something. So that means you either fix or remove those flickering tests. You need to look at the root cause. Is the root cause due to your own coding practice? Is it due to application behavior, due to the environment, due to data? Whatever the source is of that flickering or flaky test, you need to find out. But no matter what, you cannot allow that to be included in your consistent execution, because you're just incurring additional maintenance costs every time you execute, and you're hurting the trustworthiness of your execution. Another common challenge that I've seen is extremely long tests. These are tests that are 300 lines long, they validate dozens of things, and when they fail, they skip the rest of the steps in there. And so you not only have a failure to investigate, but you have a number of black spots where you have no idea what's going on. Like the test is just there without any sort of additional coverage. So you need to follow those similar practices that you'd expect from unit tests and apply that same pattern across the board. So for one, unit tests and integration tests should take priority over those UI tests. And those UI tests should focus on validating one user behavior, no more, no less. So automate UI as needed to verify end user behavior, but focus your efforts on those unit and integration tests. Another common challenge, and this is not just for automation, this applies against all software when we talk about technical debt, is our goal is to finish the work, get to production. You know, you're automating just for the next day when it comes to testing. So you can't take that approach and expect to be long-term successful with your test suite. What you need to do is to treat your automation code with the same way you would expect development code to be treated. That is to say, you want to implement good practices like dry, don't repeat yourself, KISS, which is keep it simple, stupid, with scheduled code reviews, code analysis tools, and refactoring sessions. I will see teams where their development code has been peer reviewed by multiple people before it actually gets merged into a release branch, but that same test automation is just a single person working on it. Well, if we don't trust, our developers to push changes to a release without peer review, why are we trusting the test that is going to validate that application behavior as single-threaded people? We want to have multiple individuals involved in the review and execution of our automation. So your framework that you build should be built for long-term extensibility, as in if you are walking out of the doors of your company one day, that framework could still be in use years later because you've designed it to be extensible, to be long-term valuable. So don't just automate to get to the next day, automate for the long term. And I've also seen automated tests lagging behind development, where teams will say the work is done on one sprint, but then they have testing on another sprint. How is the work actually done if you haven't validated the change that you put in place? So what you need to do is to make sure that automation feasibility is incorporated into the definition of ready, and those completed scripts are in the definition of done. Set a bare bones expectation that your automated test should execute in at least one environment before you set that story to done. And then the expectation for a given release is that that automated test successfully executes in every environment on your path to production. You need to make sure that this is in place, again, for the long term, and that automation is running concurrently with development, and work for a given story is not done until the testing is complete. So how do you actually schedule this in? If we have the expectation that development work and automation testing should be done within a single sprint, how should teams approach this problem? Well, one is collaboratively, of course. And we'll use example mapping for this. So example mapping was originally developed by Matt Wynn, he of Cucumber fame, that applies the BDD principles of discovery, formulation, and automation. In this collaborative approach, we expect members of the team to come together during backlog refinement or specification workshops, whatever you may call it, when you're going through the process of identifying the work that the team should pull in to a given sprint. So you start in an example mapping session with a given user story, and the focus is just a single user story. For each user story, the team is going to identify the business rules, aka the business logic that needs to be implemented for that story. For each rule that you identify, you're going to have one or more examples to illustrate that rule. These are the beginnings of your test cases. And any questions the assembled group in that backlog refinement or example mapping session that occurs should be written down on red question cards here. This is for you to take outside of the session to ask maybe your enterprise architecture or a third-party vendor or someone else who's a SME who'd be able to give you a clear answer. So why? Why use example mapping? Well, those examples that you show end up becoming user scenarios. Those are the foundations for your tests. Because the team is collaborating on the work to be pulled into the team space, it creates a shared understanding of the work to be done. It also reduces rework of large or unclear stories because the team is empowered to break it apart into its component parts. And those rules end up becoming acceptance criteria. That business logic are viable candidates to become those integration tests, or if you've made it as small as possible, even unit tests. Why use that color-coded scheme, though? Why should you create an example map? And this could be in person, or for like a lot of us who are working hybrid or remote on, say, a Miro board or cardboarded. Well, if you have a lot of red question cards in that single example map, that's a good indication that development work is not ready to begin. So the team can reject it, because at the end of the example mapping session, you have a thumbs up or a thumbs down as a vote. So you want to empower the team to pull in the work or say, no, we don't quite know enough about this to have confidence to begin. Red question cards is a good way to identify, here are the blockers for us to actually do this work. If you have too many blue business rules underneath a single user story, that is a good indication that user story is too dense, and that user story should be split into 2 or more parts. Now, if you do this live during an example mapping session, you still continue with the session, but just focused on that single user story. The other ones you split off can wait for later. If you have too many green examples underneath a single business rule, that is a good indication that rule is too dense, and you need to split that rule apart into 2 or more components. So that's why you have this sort of visualization and color coded. It gives you a general idea of large or unclear stories, of rules that are too dense. You want to make it easier for the developers to implement and for folks doing testing to actually implement those validations. So what are some additional quality standards that we can adopt as an organization to help us out, or on an individual team level? Well, One thing that I recommend that teams adopt is regression review. So this is an activity that you do every time you push a change into production. In this regression review, you have the equivalent of a test lead, whoever just wants to step up within your team to take ownership of any net new tests that you have, as well as all the existing regression for that application. They're going to go into a meeting that's also going to be tended by your production support. The production support could be developers on your team, or it could be a separate group within your organization. Prod support should provide metrics on the incidents for that application for the release in a prior period. You want to see where you're having trouble with escape defects. Additionally, your business partners are going to provide metrics on application usage broken down by feature. Again, we can't test everything underneath the sun, nor can we automate everything under the sun, nor should we. We should focus our efforts on those areas that are the most highly trafficked and the ones that generate the most revenue for our company. So we want to see that with empirical evidence to make a decision on what we should actually test. And lastly, whoever is the ultimate owner, whether it's a product owner or you have an app owner, whatever you may call it within your organization, they should provide that list of upcoming projects with high-level feature changes. It wouldn't make much sense for you to devote a lot of time creating a great deal of test coverage around a given feature of your application if your plan is to immediately change it or to deprecate it. You need to see that roadmap for your product so you can focus your efforts on the things that are going to be most valuable. Engaging in this regression review, which should take no more than an hour, will allow you to focus on what tests should be added into your regression suite, what tests should be removed or modified, and where do you have gaps in your coverage. Up to this point, I've shown you a lot of Marvel superheroes. Here's my own personal superhero from real life. His name is Martin Fowler. He says, "I'm not a great programmer. I'm just a good programmer with great habits." So what lessons can we learn from Martin Fowler? Well, we want to implement code reviews, of course, the same as we would expect for any development code. We want to check to make sure that all automation scripts for the feature are scripted, that it's understandable by the team, that our automation represents the current state of our application as living documentation, that the scripts don't duplicate effort already present, because we want to keep the actual glue code underneath the covers as tight and small as possible. We want to make sure that when we're implementing a task that we are cross-environment compatible and that we followed all standards and practices followed by the teams on traceability back to development work, writing standards, formatting, etc. So expect code reviews just the same as our application under test. Additionally, you should engage in regular refactoring sessions. These refactoring sessions should focus on the maintainability of your application, the extensibility of your automation suite, and ensuring domain knowledge is spread throughout all members of your team. That automation suite should represent the current state of your application. It should be a good form of onboarding. So in refactoring sessions, you're going to look at the performance of your automation tests, implementing non-orthogonal design to keep your test suite tight, ensuring that you don't have duplicated effort, and that you've stripped away that outdated knowledge. If it's not needed for the application going forward, it's not needed for your automated tests. But it's easy for me to say, hey, you should refactor. How do you actually make this practical and something that's independent of, say, a single person being the champion for it? I recommend hosting regular refactoring sessions, 30 minutes at most, once a week, where you identify a team lead. That person is responsible for scheduling it, delegating the work, selecting the focus area for that given refactoring session, and creating any sort of bug reports. You want to make refactoring a team activity. In that team activity, you're also going to have an automation guide. This is someone that can be on the team, who is the strongest resource in the automation space, or it can be an individual from outside the team as a part of sort of that peer review process. That technical oracle will help you overcome challenges. They're also going to keep track of what occurs during that session, including any action items that people need to engage in after the session. They're also going to keep track of an improvement status report. There are a number of tools that you can use for code analysis, for linting, that can show you the quality of your code. Well, if you keep track of that over time, you can show that even though your application is changing, that the number of tests in your automation suite is growing, that you're still maintaining good quality, and you're improving actually because of these sessions. This is to demonstrate that value add of having a refactoring session. Lastly, in the focus area that the team lead is going to select is it could be based upon your code metric report. It could be based upon a given feature item that someone's working on, or an overall project release, or your regression that you're executing, or even maybe logs that you've come from your CI report that you want to investigate within your application. All these are viable areas with which to devote your time, and making this regularly scheduled makes it independent of a single person. And that's the goal for a lot of these mature activities. You don't want to have it become sort of like an Old Testament prophet approach where it's one person driving this, and as soon as they leave the team, leave the organization, that it stops. You want to make it independent of a single person. You want this practice to be a common team practice, so that way it occurs regardless of who's there. If someone's on vacation, they're out sick, or they left the company. All right. So in summary, what did we learn today with regards to test automation? Well, for one, you should focus on the fastest, most robust tests. You want to create UI and end-to-end tests as needed. So focus on unit tests first over service, service over UI, and UI over end-to-end tests. Additionally, you want to build based on the probability of failure, the impact on business, and the complexity of those automated tests. And lastly, it's understandable. You're always going to be restricted by budget, schedule, technical skill set. Some of these things that you can change over time by showing the value, some of which are just going to be constant. Optimize within those system of constraints that you have. You can't generate the perfect solution, nor should you become frustrated at your inability to do so, but you can generate the best solution given your circumstance. And that's really where your focus should be. So, as I mentioned, I have additional material based upon metrics, but what I want to do right now is to take a pause for questions that you may have related to the presentation I've just given here, as well as a little plug for my company, M&T Bank, of which we have M&T Tech branding specifically for the technology division. So if you're looking for a new career, we are indeed hiring. So it is a large financial institution. We have both hybrid as well as full remote models available for folks if you're looking for a new job. So let me take a pause there. We'll answer some questions, and then with the remaining time before I switch over to my compatriot here for the 11 o'clock session, we can go through some of the metrics as needed. So I'll pass it back to you, Larry.
Yeah, thanks. That was interesting, very interesting, and I like the way you presented. I love the superheroes. Yes, definitely love the superheroes. I think I want to borrow your slide deck to copy it.
Well, if folks want to check, search for me on YouTube, you see just about every presentation I do is thematic. So last month for May the 4th, for Star Wars, I had several Star Wars themed presentations that I sent out there. So I try to at least make it visually entertaining if people don't exactly enjoy my content.
Yeah, well, brilliant. I mean, one of the things that strike me, I mean, if I have a question for you, but one of the things that strike me is I like the way you make it, the way you looked at it in terms of what you should automate, and how. And I think that's one of the things. That's one of the main things that I think I want you to stress on a bit. So the question is, what and how do you choose things to automate within, let me say, within a sprint? How, what? I just want you to elaborate a little more on it. So yeah.
Yeah. So what I showed there was a selection of sort of the automation checklist. And so what I like to do to help when I'm onboarding team members, and a lot of times when I'm working with folks on, say, an individual team and I'm helping them start from literal zero, is I like to provide that checklist for them just to take with them, to have it as a reference. So that way, when they're going through that refinement, tasking session, whatever you call the work intake process at your work, that they're answering the same questions on, all right, for this given feature, this change, is this something that is feasible and viable for automation? And providing that checklist is useful because we all have our own biases. We all have our own opinions about what can and should be automated. What we really want to do is standardize that, not just for a team, but across the board around making those quality related decisions such that I don't care who's in that session for that given time. I'm going to get the same answer based upon our organization's or team's values. So that's where I look at it. It's like, is this something that's going to be extremely time consuming? Is it repetitive? Is the state of the system going to remain steady? And that's like a key point for automation is, there are certain AI based tools that you can use that, are going to be adaptive based upon your circumstance. But a lot of automation is like deterministic, like it's expected to have the same result time after time. And so you want to make sure that the state of your system doesn't change. So that way your automated tests that you're writing are also going to be consistent. So it's like you write it once and you can leave it. Like that's the ideal is for an automated test. If you write it once and you can execute it many, 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 many times without going through maintenance, that's where you're going to get your most ROI.
Yep, I'm a preacher of that. I fully agree with you on that one. Right, the test where it could be repeated consistently without you actually having to touch it for any reason whatsoever. And that brings me to your whole definition of done, definition of ready when coming to testing. And I think that's one of the points that a lot of people miss is that you could have a definition of done in one sprint, and that definition of done is actually the definition of ready in the next. So how do you stress that to members of your team?
Yeah, I'd say that that's another challenge I'm sure you've encountered it like over the many years supporting is it's really difficult to get people to change their behaviors. And it's especially difficult from just testing period for people to see the value in it because it's oftentimes like the first thing that is cut whenever you're coming closer to deadlines. Like we practice more deadline driven development than we do iterative development. That
Yeah.
timeline is getting short. What are things that we can give up and still push this to production? We're like, well, we can give up on some of the validation or test automation component. So what I like to do is take it farther, is go into like the area when we talk about metrics to show folks exactly the value that is being provided by automation, that by us skipping automation even for a sprint and having the gaps in your test coverage, that it's going to end up leading to a lot of problems and lost revenue long term. And you have to show that empirically and you have to keep on showing that consistently. That's why I like to generate a lot of metrics and dashboards around the value that you're getting from automation or showing the loss that you have every time you decide to skip out on it. So you can't be perfect with automation and show that you have complete coverage, but you can, for instance, show that you have all of your business rules, as in like your application behavior, under some form of automation. You can end up showing the defect savings by finding automation in, say, a given environment and attach values to that. Like, how would you do that within your organization? Or you like to go back and advocate for like our automation being done in one sprint means that it's a ready state criteria for us to continue doing work in the next one. Well, you have to calculate within your company how much the defects cost you where you find them. So like for a production incident, what is the average hourly rate for a developer multiplied by how long it took to fix that defect in production, multiplied by the number of people who are involved in there? That quickly adds up. And that's not even calculating the impact to the end users when you have that defect in production, which you should also add in. So you can end up showing a great body of work that says by us cutting out on automation for one or two people that would have spent like 8 hours doing this, we cost tens of thousands of dollars to our organization by cutting it short here. And you have to consistently show that.
Yeah, gotcha. And I have a question here from one of our listeners. Sachin, actually, his question is SB, which is specification by example, is that the way forward for shift left? Write specification which is codable and the single source of truth for all.
I say it is one path forward. It is not the way forward. And I say it really depends upon the team or the organization. A good example would be is like you can use specification by example, but it's intended to be a collaborative exercise amongst all members of the team. If you have, for whatever reason, team members or your organization split to like business and technology where they're not looking at it, like what good is it to have that layer of abstraction that's, written in plain English if only the person writing the automation test is actually seeing that? Like in this case, you just created some additional overhead. You might as well just get straight to the code. So I'd say it depends upon your organization for what's the best fit. I think it leads to the best outcomes for an organization, like making something that's transparent for all members of the team where we're all speaking the same language will help reduce that rework. But it doesn't mean that every organization is going to end up practicing that. I would say it's just a good practice. It's not the practice, though.
Yeah, and that is so. I think people say that is so true. I mean, especially when coming to the single source of truth for all thing. Now we have that's a lot. That's a next one of those next tentacles that we need to look at, because we have people say, why don't we put it here and we'll use that as the single source of truth. But then you still have you have to tell yourself who is going to see it, who is going to interact with it, what kind of control you have over it. Because if you could write in it and then I could go and change things without anybody else knowing, that just models the whole single source of truth thing. So yeah, I guess it's one of those things where is it worth it for me now, or is it worth it for me in this particular scenario, and to use that. So yeah, I'm really cool with that. And just one other thing, you mentioned the whole when coming to refactoring, and it must be a team effort. I like the way you say, a refactoring guy. I like that. I definitely like how you say the refactoring guy, to look at it. What do you think should be one of the biggest takeaways for the audience when coming to refactoring, especially
Yeah.
test code?
Yeah. So I'd say, there's multiple value propositions with it. One of those is the state where you have, a senior member or maybe a couple senior members of your team, and you of course have junior members of the team. Conducting refactoring as a group session allows you to impart knowledge to uplift more junior members of the team. So it's a way to provide value to the application itself, but also to uplift members of the team. Additionally, like because we are doing this on a regular basis and ensuring that we are sort of like pruning our garden, so to speak, we are making sure that the automation suite is in a good state no matter the circumstance. So that way we're confident in the results that we get. So conducting these as a formal session rather than individual breaks down those silos. Make sure that it's something that's communal, and make sure that we show value. And I think that's something you're going to see like consistently, like with the things that I've talked about today, is a lot of it is about creating those deliverables that show the value of automation. And that is because you all listening today, presumably you're all involved in some way in the quality aspect of your company or organization. Is we have to consistently show value with empirical evidence to change minds, to make sure that we're given the same degree of care that you would expect the development team members to. So showing empirical evidence is one way to do so. Be consistent advocates for quality and do so backed up by data.
Yeah, thanks. That was very well done, Thomas. And I want to thank you for taking the time out to come and have a chat with us, and spread a little bit of the awesomeness onwards to the community. In saying that, so thank you very much. And if without further ado, would you like to? I'll give you this one. You have 1 minute to wrap it up and say, that's put in your plug for the community.
Yeah, so I would say there's a lot of information out there. When you're trying to learn like what's the best tooling that you can leverage, as well as what's the best approach you can take. I'd say assimilate as much of that information as you can. Don't just go by one source. Pull in and find the best solution state that's going to work for your organization. No two organizations are alike. No two teams are really alike. So be flexible in that approach and educate yourself as much as possible. This sort of webinar, Zappletech, is one of those great ways to do so, to expose yourself to how other people have done things in the industry. So keep on growing, keep on learning. Thank you very much for your time.